Good morning, guys. Happy Friday. Hopefully, you guys had a good week. 2 weeks down into our online learning. Hopefully, it's coming smoother. I think it is becoming a little bit more smooth for you guys because I'm getting less messages from you guys throughout the day. So that's positive. But yeah, so today I did something. I left the hidden camera yesterday in my jungle, and I just wanted to share with some of the footage that I found from the jungle. Here we go. So in my jungle, we have Legos. We have a snail, a bee that wants to come in. We have some ants carrying strawberries, honey nut Cheerios, leaves. We have some mushrooms that look like ladybugs, and we have another ladybug. We have a huge apple with a nice little butterfly on top. And a baby snake. Not a worm, but a snake. And I think that's everything that I caught in my little jungle. So yeah, pretty interesting. So if any of you guys want some extra credit, you guys are more than welcome to come over to my house and cut down the grass or do whatever you want. I know Alonso and Santi already volunteered, but if anybody else wants to come down and mow the lawn, you're more than welcome to, and I'll give you extra credit. But anywho, let's go on and get into the lessons for today. Alright, so yesterday we talked about the explorations of Lewis and Clark and also of Zublion Pike. And remember, the whole purpose of these explorations was they wanted to go and see what was out there in these newly acquired lands. Just like when you buy a new game or buy a new toy, you want to explore everything. Or you go to a new level in a video game, you want to see what everything has, what you can do there. Same thing with the Americans. They wanted to see what they could do with their new lands, what the land was good for, and everything like that. On Lewis and Clark's expedition, the whole purpose of the expedition was to go and find a river that would take them to the Pacific Ocean. When they did this, they got to meet some cool Native Americans such as Sacagawea, and Sacagawea was one of them that just helped them the whole way through, showed them the plants to eat, what food to eat, what was safe, what wasn't safe, and she was a big help to Lewis and Clark. Zublion Pike, what he was sent out to do was to find the beginning of the Red River. When he got to the Colorado Rockies, he actually went to the top to have like a lookout point, and he actually got arrested. And he got arrested by the Spanish because it was part of the Spanish territory. And when they arrested him, they took him back to their Spanish lands, and that's how he got to explore the Southwest. And so that was really important because that was the first time we ever discovered the Southwest, and we didn't know anything about the Southwest until that adventure. So now that they both reported back to Jefferson, everybody knew what was going on, and now we're gonna get into another war. Because, just like when we find out new things, we're gonna go ahead and take it for our own, and we're gonna want to go ahead and kick everybody off the land and everything like that. So today we are gonna talk about the coming of a war. We're gonna talk about some violations. We're gonna talk about some acts that they put in place that people were violating, that the U.S. thought would work. So let's go ahead and get into that today. But first, let's go ahead and review the questions from yesterday. All right, so number one, what were some challenges that the expedition faced? Some of the challenges that they faced was they were traveling through these lands that were never traveled before, or they were uncharted territories. So they didn't know what to expect. When they started to explore, there was no way for them to go ahead and receive any new supplies from anybody. They were pretty much on their own. Transportation was difficult because remember, they had to go up and down through the rivers, and they didn't know what was going on. So sometimes there was rapids, or sometimes there was trees in there, rocks that they had to be careful of. So traveling was very difficult. And also they ran into a lot of bugs, insects, and these things were biting them. Some of them got like allergic reactions, and they were just seeing these insects before that they never seen before. And then the last thing is that they were scared of people attacking them. You didn't know what was out there. You met these Native Americans, but you would have never guessed if the Native Americans were going to be nice or if they're going to be resentful against these Americans because of how the Americans were treating all Native Americans at the time. Number 2, what did the Lewis and Clark expedition achieve? So the Lewis and Clark expedition, what they achieved was they achieved their goal, and their goal was to find a river, excuse me, a river that would take them to the Pacific Ocean. And they actually did that. They found the Columbia River, which was just over the Rocky Mountains thanks to Sacagawea. And they found the beginning of where a river hits the Pacific Ocean. And they also explored all of the northern parts of the US, and they reported back all the food, all the landscapes, and everything like that. So it was really cool. Number 3, what was the purpose of Pike's expedition? Just like Lewis and Clark, Pike was sent out to find a river, but his purpose was to find the beginning of the Red River. So this was another river that was in the southern areas of the United States, but they wanted to see where this river ended to see if they could build a port, or to see what they can transport up and down this river. Alright, so today we are going to talk about the coming of a war. We're going to talk about how the U.S. ships, how they were trading back and forth with Britain and France, but while they were trading, Britain and France were in a war, and violations started happening because they wanted to stop the U.S. people from trading because they thought they were supplying supplies to Britain, or they were supplying it to France. So Britain and France started to take matters in their own hands, and they started to attack the U.S. ships. So this is what we're going to talk about today, so let's go ahead and get into it. So the coming of war, it's inevitable. There's always going to be war, and especially in these times, war is not the answer, but back then it was seen as the answer. So the United States tried to stay neutral in the conflicts between France and Britain, but this was impossible to avoid. It was impossible to avoid getting involved. French and British ships interfered with American trade across the Atlantic Ocean, and the British also caused trouble along the western frontiers. Many of these Americans began to urge war with Great Britain once again. So during the late 1700s and the 1800s, American merchant ships, or trading ships, they were going across the ocean constantly because of the trade. Overseas trade was very profitable, like they were making a lot of money from this trade, but it was also really risky, and it was because of the pirates. And yes, they were real pirates back then. So ships, they had to travel these far distances, and even though they had to face these violent storms, nothing was more violent than these attacks from the pirates. So what would happen is that these ships, they would be sailing, these merchant ships, other ships, these pirates would see these ships, they would go and attack them and try to steal all their goods for themselves. And this was really risky because there was a lot more pirates in the middle of the ocean than there were violent storms. Okay? So these ships, or these pirate ships, typically they were closer to Africa, and like when they were traveling to the Mediterranean Sea. So the Atlantic was fine, but when they got to the Mediterranean, that's just when all the pirates were, and most of these pirate ships were from Africa. So all these things, they would stop them, but attacks eventually stopped when they started to send this warship out there, and that's the actual warship. That warship is actually located, or it's docked in Boston, and you can go and visit it to this day. So it's kind of cool that it's still intact. It's not even that big, but back then it was huge. It was a huge warship. So the U.S., they sent this warship. It's called the USS Constitution, and this was a warship. And pretty much what this warship was like its bodyguards for all the merchant ships. So we had the Navy on this ship, and pretty much what they were doing was they would escort the merchant ships across the Atlantic into the Mediterranean Sea to trade. But this little ship did not stop the problems. So even though the pirates were a serious problem, that wasn't the biggest threat. The biggest threat was Britain and France. So while Britain and France, they were still in war in 1803, each country wanted to stop the U.S. from supplying goods to each other. So the U.S. were supplying goods to France, they were supplying goods to Britain, and they weren't supplying it just to help them out in war, they were supplying it to make money, okay? But the countries thought that they were trying to give each other an advantage, which was not true. So each government, the French and the British, they passed these laws that prevented American merchants from trading with each other. And in addition, these British and French navies captured a lot of the American merchant ships, and they began to just hijack them. So they pretty much set a law saying we're going to ban trade with each other. And now France and Britain, they became the new pirates, and they started to hijack these British or these American ships and looking for war supplies. But that was another problem. The other problem was when they started to do this, the British ships, they began stopping and searching American ships, and they started to search their ships for British sailors who may have ran away from Britain to get free, and they didn't want to fight anymore. So what the British were doing was they're forcing sailors to return to British ships, and sometimes they would take American Navy members mistakenly as British members, and they would force them to serve in the army. This is what we call impressment. So impressment was the practice of forcing people to serve in their army. So while the British people were searching for supplies, they were also searching for members from their army. But since they needed people for their army, they started to pretty much kidnap American citizens and force them to serve in the British army. And that's what we call impressment. Okay? So soon, Britain was even targeting American ships. So now Britain has their hands full. They want to attack the French, and now they also want to attack the Americans, which is going to be bad. Okay, so because once you mess with the Americans, it's going to be pretty much over, especially if the U.S. and Britain didn't get along in the first place. So in response to the British attacking these Americans, a lot of Americans wanted to go to war. But Jefferson didn't think war was the answer because we know it is expensive. And he didn't want to get into this tri-war with France and Britain again. That was their problems, and he didn't want to get involved. So some Americans wanted to go to war. Others wanted to do this thing called the embargo. And the embargo was pretty much banning all trade. So they would ban trade with France, they would ban trade with Britain, and pretty much just stop all trade with all foreign people. And they thought that if they banned all this stuff, it would punish the other countries, and excuse me, and they would pretty much say apologize to U.S. for attacking them, and then hopefully negotiate to bring trade back. That was the goal. So punish them by stop giving them what they want, and hopefully things will cool down. In 1804, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act banning all trade with foreign countries, so closing of all the ports, not sending any merchant ships over there, and everything like that. But it had the exact opposite effect. It did not punish the British or the French one bit. They could care less. What it really did was it hurt American merchants. And these merchants, they lost so much money. So in this time that they closed down all the ships or all the trading, they lost about $85 million. And that's a whole lot of money back then. And this was just in a few months that led on to a few years eventually. And it was really harmful to the American economy. This really damaged Jefferson's reputation and popularity. He just got reelected in 1804, and everyone was loving Jefferson until this Embargo Act. Once this happened, everyone started to hate him. The Federalists became angry because, remember, they relied on trading and manufacturing, and Jefferson started to receive a lot of these death threats or these death letters saying that you need to take off this Embargo Act because you're hurting the economy, you're hurting our business, everything like that. So Jefferson had to rethink it once again. And like I said before, this Embargo Act, it was meant to punish the British and the French, but it had really no effect on them. All it did was it backfired on the Americans, made the American people upset, the American economy was suffering, and Jefferson, just reelected, began to get death threats, and people just stopped respecting Jefferson because of this move that he made. So after 5 years, Congress finally tried to pass a new law, and this new law was called the Non-Intercourse Act. And pretty much what they did was they reinvented the Embargo Act, and they pretty much just banned trade with only Britain, France, and their colonies. So they started to trade with Spain again, they started to trade with Asia, they started to trade with Africa to bring the economy back, but they still didn't trade with Britain and France and their colonies. They decided that the first country that will stop attacking these American merchant ships will be the first country they start to negotiate peace treaties with and they'll start trading with again. This act in time was still not successful. Britain and France, they were the main people that we were trading with, and trying to punish them was not right. It's just like in school, if we say stop eating hot Cheetos, we take away all the hot Cheetos. As soon as you get them, you guys are going to be like Cookie Monster and just eating all the hot Cheetos. So same thing here. They tried to take away something. It didn't work. And Britain and France, they found other ways to find things. Remember, back in the American Revolution, they opened up that black market. So people were still smuggling goods and finding ways to get things to Britain and France. So both these acts, the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act, were both not a success for the Americans. So as a quick review, as the American ships were trading back and forth, the French and British were in a war like always, and the U.S. was just trying to trade, but trading was very dangerous. They had to worry about pirates. They had to worry about the British soldiers hijacking the ships, taking off their people, the Americans, and forcing them into the British Army. This was known as the impressment. They also had to worry about the French hijacking and taking their ships as well. So Jefferson wanted to punish both the French and the British by setting this new law called the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act was set to punish them, but to stop trade with all foreign countries. This act was a horrible decision because it not only did it have no effect on these foreign countries, it hurt the American economy. American economy started to lose so much money. Merchants started to get angry. Jefferson was losing popularity, and he also started to get death threats. So in response, they decided to go ahead and try a different act called the Non-Intercourse Act, where they're only going to ban trade with the French, and the British. This act was still not a success, even though they opened trade with other countries. But remember, France and Britain were the main sources of trade, and they needed these people. So both of these trades bans were horrible decisions, and they really hurt the U.S. economy, but they had good intentions. They were trying to protect the people and protect their ships, but in reality, it was a bad decision. So number 1, for homework, why did Congress pass the Embargo Act? Be specific, be detailed here. Number 2, what were the reasons for the failure of the Embargo Act? And number 3, what was the Non-Intercourse Act? So these answers are pretty straightforward, but try to answer them in your own words and be descriptive. Okay? Thank you. So today we talked about the coming of war with merchant ships and trading with the British and the French. When we come back next week, we are going to talk about another war with the Native Americans. So we'll get into that. But other than that, I hope you guys have a good weekend and see you guys in the Zoom session. Bye.